I think the simplest thing and the simplest way of understanding it is that honorable men, the autopsy surgeons were honorable men, were given an impossible task, told what the conclusions would be before they started the autopsy of the century. They then did very sloppy work by all accounts. Their conclusions stand in the face of logic, in fact. And then they were caught lying. They were caught lying about the autopsy photographs. They tried to stonewall official government investigators. They tried to stonewall their fellow colleagues in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And official reports have been unreliable. You read what official reports said, and they're just not truthful. Why is there a reason to suspect that he was shot from the right front, in addition perhaps to also from behind? Well, perhaps the biggest reason to think that is that with that fatal shot, immediately after that fatal shot, he's driven backward and to the left. Now, what you'll read and hear from, quote, official sources is that there's an explanation for that. And the explanation for that is that there was a jet effect. He was shot from behind, but because the bullet went in small and emerged large, there was a huge jet of ejected material forward that drove the head back. And the largest proponent of that is a man who won a Nobel laureate, who a Nobel Prize in physics, Luis Alvarez. And he wrote that in the September 1976 issue of the American Journal of Physics, that he had done experiments that had proved just that, and that is that with melon shooting experiments, shot from behind, the melons moved back toward the rifle. And he reported that if he had just cherry-picked his data and only reported results that confirmed the jet effect theory, that he could be criticized. But as they did the test, these are the results they found, and therefore he concluded that Kennedy was shot from above and behind, or at least from behind, driving the head backward. What we didn't know then, but we found out in the last year and a half or so, is that Luis Alvarez shot at a lot of things. He shot at coconuts, he shot at water bottles, he shot at pineapples. Everything he shot at flew away from him except the melons. The melons are the only thing that he reported. And the melon shooting experiments were not analogous to Kennedy's situation for lots of reasons. A bullet will cut through a soft carapaced melon very, very easily, whereas a skull represents a much firmer resistance. So we basically also know that Luis Alvarez, Nobel laureate in physics, lied. But then the other explanation given for the rearward thrust of Kennedy's head was one advanced by a fellow named Larry Sturtevant, who's one of these experts who you will see on Nova Series and other places and wildly heralded as a great expert. He's been debunked on numerous occasions, but on the neuromuscular reaction theory, his idea is that he was hit in the head. It caused the brain to be shaken severely across, the whole head to be shaken, and there was an immediate neuro discharge from the brain down through the spinal column, which led to a reaction of all the nerves at once. And he showed goat shooting experiments that show that when a goat was shot in the head, that the back arms and the back arch backward. He showed a picture of the so-called Frank Capra fallen soldier image, where in 1936, a soldier in the Spanish-American War was shot in the head, and you see him marching backward after a shot in the head. And it turns out that all of this is nonsense. First of all, Frank Capra, the fallen soldier, which if anybody wants to Google that up, will see a picture of the image. It was not a shot of a man being shot of a head. It wasn't shot where the Frank Capra said it was. And the goat shooting experiments do show the upper arms arching backward and the legs arching backwards before the goat collapses. But that's not what you see in the Kennedy case. That's not what you see after Zapruder 313. What you see after Zapruder 313 is his head leading backwards and his body following limply. His head is being driven backwards and his body's following limply. Now people argue, well, a small caliber bullet doesn't have enough momentum to drive a skull backwards. That's probably true if you hit the skull through thin bone, say right in the middle of the temple. May well not be true if you hit the bone tangentially toward the top of the head. And if you hit the bone toward the top of the head, you will have to drive the bullet through, a tangent of bone, and that will represent a lot more resistance to the passage of the bullet, depositing a lot more momentum on the skull, and that certainly would be enough to drive that skull backwards. And that's what you see in the Kennedy case. So you have that as one thing. The other thing that you have is the X-rays show a pattern of fragments of bullets. And, if he had been shot low in the rear of the head, the way the Warren Commission said he was, you'd see bullet fragments down there. Now, the autopsy pathologist reported that, yes, there are a trail of bullet fragments down at the bottom of the skull that extend upward toward the external. And then later on, other reviewers said, well, the autopsy doctors got it wrong. The bullet actually entered a little higher, but there's a bullet trail to that higher entrance wound. Well, they're both nonsense. And it's not just my conclusion. I've seen the originals. But you'll find it even in books by others, as well as the House Select Committee's X-ray experts. The trail of fragments is right along the top of the skull. That's where the trail of fragments is, right up there near the top of the skull. So none of the official evidence hangs together. The official evidence is consistently been proven wrong. And yet you have article after article in the peer-reviewed literature coming out, defending the official version. And I've given a number of talks on junk science at JFK, and I defy people and ask them. I said, I will pay anyone. I will not asking for a bet. I will write them a check for $200 if they can show me one article in the peer-reviewed literature that has not been debunked. Because every peer-reviewed literature defending the official Warren Commission's conclusion that has not been debunked scientifically. Not because some crackpot thinks it doesn't make any sense, but something which anyone who's reasonably sensible can determine.
Now, not too long ago, an atmospheric chemist who does a lot of work for the government, Nicholas Nally, published some papers supporting the idea of a jet effect, that the expulsion of brain material going out to the right of Jack Kennedy's skull is what drove him back to the left, at least initially. And then that was added. Then after that, there was a neuromuscular reaction, which then drove him back further to the left, back into the left. It made no sense. His supposition, knowing that the brain in evidence weighed 1,500 grams, Nick Nally said, well, given how much material must have been ejected from his skull to drive him back to the left, Kennedy's brain prior to autopsy must have weighed 2,100 grams. That doesn't even pass the laugh test. Human brains just don't weigh that much. So, but to maintain the idea that Oswald did it, you have guys like Nicholas Nally in a, quote, peer-reviewed journal saying that Kennedy's brain prior to autopsy must have weighed 2,100 grams because it was the loss of 600 grams of material ejecting forward to the right that drove him backward. Well, that makes no sense because human brains just don't weigh that much, period. End of sentence. They don't. But then there are other issues that come to the fore having to do with the defect in Jack Kennedy's skull. The original autopsy report says that Kennedy's skull defect was 13 centimeters in anterior posterior direction. In other words, from the top of his head, there was 13 centimeters of brain tissue missing, or of skull tissue missing, and yet that's not true either. If you look at the autopsy face sheet written by J. Thornton Boswell, there is a notation, and that was written during the autopsy, and it says 17 missing. And he was asked under oath. I asked him myself, other people have asked him. He said, when we first got the body, we measured the skull defect, and it was 17 centimeters of tissue missing, of skull missing. Okay. And when they got some fragments of bone that were flown in from Dallas, and they put it back into the rear of the skull, then the skull defect only measured 13 centimeters, and that's what they put in the autopsy report. But the original wound, as described by the autopsy doctors on the night of the autopsy, when they had the body right in front of them, was 17 centimeters. And I asked people, okay, get yourself a caliper, put it on the human head of an average human like me, and I've done this, and let's assume that the defect goes just to the hairline, because we know that obviously his forehead isn't missing, okay? So we know that the defect goes right to about to Jack Kennedy's hairline, and you take the caliper back, that defect would have gone all the way well back into occipital bone, way back into the bone where they sit, where the official version has it and the House Select Committee version has it. There was no defect back there, but there had to have been, just by the simple mathematics of the measurement of the skull defect as noted on the night of the autopsy. So there was a huge defect on the right side of the skull. And then there's this business about jet effect. Well, the jet effect won't work for multiple reasons. We can go into those if you'd like some real detail on that. But the jet effect won't work for multiple reasons, because the jet effect, any jet effect that would have caused would have had minimal effect, because it was also, if he was shot from behind, the impact of the bullet on the back of the skull would have driven the skull forward. Well, how do we know that? Well, you'll see there was a video produced with Gary Mack of the Sixth Floor Museum, and you can find it on Vimeo or online someplace, inside the target car, where they tried to duplicate the shot from above and behind using Mannlicher Arcanos on a skull, on a test skull, where they tried to match the hardness of a skull and the contents of the brain tissue and all that sort of stuff. And they shot that in this duplication test from above and behind. And sure enough, they showed a defect on the right side of the skull. But you watch the video, the skull doesn't go back. Okay. The US government at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, for the biophysics lab at Aberdeen Proving Grounds in 1964, did skull shooting experiments. And they filled human skulls with brain equivalent material, shot them from above and behind. All of them went away from the rifle. None of them recoiled back from the rifle.
And they were shattered too, right? They were shattered.
Oh yeah, there was, and more interestingly enough, I've written about this, and you can see the images from the original high-speed films that were shot at, I think, 2,200 frames a second. So you could really see what's happening. The original egress of material, when they shot them from behind, the original egress of material is from the entrance. In other words, you start seeing a puff of stuff coming out of the back of the skull before it explodes to the front, and then both front and back explode with about as much material exploding backward as explodes forward. That's what happens when you actually shoot human skull. Now, unfortunately, they're not an exact duplication, because these are not living skulls. These are desiccated, dried skulls, but they're filled with brain equivalent material. But there's been a huge pressure to try to convince people that that the skull shooting experiments, that you shot from behind, and that there was a jet effect that removed backward. And perhaps the most notorious defender of this is a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Luis Alvarez of Berkeley. And in the American Journal of Physics in September of 1976, American Journal of Physics, he wrote an article reporting on his skull shooting experiments where he shot melons. And he said that melons were the best mock-up of a human head. And when he shot the melons, sure enough, the melons recoiled back toward the shooter. And he said, therefore, I think that, Kennedy was shot from above and behind. We've demonstrated this with these melon shooting experiments using something that's the best mock-up of a human head. But he didn't tell us a lot of stuff. Okay. First of all, he didn't shoot Mannlicher Arcano bullets. According to John Latimer, who also defends the Warren Commission, he supercharged the bullets and did not use jacketed bullets. He used soft-nosed bullets, and that fired not at the Mannlicher Arcano speed, about 2,000 feet per second or 2,100 feet per second. He used bullets that fired at 2,800 feet per second, and he wasn't even happy with those. So he hot loaded those so they'd travel at 3,000 feet per second. And so shooting bullets that at melons, which are totally unlike human skulls. A melon has a soft exterior. A bullet would cut through it like a knife through butter. He got jet effect by shooting the wrong kind of bullets at the wrong kind of targets. Melons weighing half what a human head weighs, but he never told us any of that in his reporting. Alvarez kept that information from the public and he kept something else that was much more important. And that is that he said, if we had shot at lots of different targets and only reported those that gave us, recoil back toward the shooter, well, we could be criticized. About 7 years ago, Josiah Thompson, the author of 6 Seconds in Dallas, who has come out with a book called Last Second in Dallas, asked a good friend of his, Paul Hoke, for any information about this. And Hoke had photographs of the original shooting experience because Paul Hoke had been a graduate student in physics, got a PhD in physics at Berkeley, and had studied under Alvarez and had been involved in those shooting tests. It turns out that from Paul Hoke's file of what they had done, they shot at lots of things. Everything went away from the rifle except the melons. Okay. And yet Alvarez said if we'd shot a lot of different things and only reported those that went back by, we could be criticized. Well, yes, let us criticize him. And let's also criticize the fact that for many years early in the case, back in the early 1990s, Paul Hoke was very defensive of Luis Alvarez. And yet his reporting was entirely dishonest. And he continues to be defended by other people like Nicholas Nally. In any case, other skull shooting tests were done that allegedly showed recoil. Some reported by John Latimer originally in some. I think it was not exactly a peer-reviewed paper, although it may have been, but he's also put it in his book, Kennedy and Lincoln. And he shot down at skulls that were perched atop ladders. And sure enough, he shot them with Mannlicher counter rifle, and those skulls came backward off the ladder. But the problem was, if you see the videos, the skulls are sitting flat on top of a ladder with his chin, the bony chin, laying flat on top of the ladder. They hit this, and he shoots them from above downward. And when they hit, the skull recoils backward, but the ladder moves forward. And as Don Thomas and other people have pointed out, what happens there is that the bullet strikes the skull, the forward momentum is driven to the ladder, which moves forward, and the skull bounces backward off it. In other words, there has been no legitimate tests that actually show recoil of bullets hitting skulls like this. And yet this is still the standard acceptance. And then, of course, there's the other explanation, as you mentioned, nerve muscle hitting, that sort of stuff, neuromuscular reaction. Anyone who is interested in this can see what I've written on the subject, because there are 3 basic types of neuromuscular reactions. And here's the concept as explained before the House Select Committee on Assassination by a guy named Larry Sturtevant, that when the head exploded, there was a discharge of neurological impulses down the spinal canal, and all the muscles were contracted. Okay, those that drive the flexor muscles and those that drive extensor muscles, like the back. And it turns out that the extensor muscles, the ones that drive in the back, are more powerful than the flexor muscles. And so that predominated, and it was that neuromuscular reaction. He's hit in the head, all the nerves fire, and the head moves back into the left because of a neuromuscular reaction. Well, the 3 types of neuromuscular reaction are decorticate, decerebrate, and neurospastic. We'll just call it that way. And just without getting too much into the weeds on this, none of those fly, for the reason that a decorticate reaction, your hands move in toward your chest like this, and your legs extend, and your back moves backward. Not necessarily your head, but your back moves backward. That's not what we see in the Zapruder film. What we see is the head moving backward and the back following it. His head still flex inward. Okay, how about decerebrate? Well, in decerebrate, and by the way, I was a trauma surgeon for a while at UCLA Harvard General Hospital, and I've seen decerebrate reactions. First of all, they don't occur instantaneously, and that's something the House Select Committee mentioned. It takes more than a second or 2 for decerebrate and decorticate reactions to take place, and these happen instantaneously. But in decorticate, your hands move in, your legs extend, and your back moves back, and your head follows. In decerebrate, your arms move out, your back moves back, and your head's extend. Well, you don't see Jack Kennedy's legs extending. You don't see his body jolting upward. You see his head moving back, and his back follows passively, and his arms fold down to his side. They don't extend outward in decerebrate. They don't across his chest in decorticate. Well, there's a last one that was talked about, and again, I've written about this, a neurospastic, let's call it. And they did some goat shooting experiments and shot goats who were restrained with 30-30 bullets. And you can see the images there in Larry Sturtevant's book. I've shown copies of them myself. And you see that the goat is hit in the head right here. And what you see is the upper arms go out and the back or the upper legs go out, the back legs go out, and he flays outward like this, the goat bite. But that's not what happens to Kennedy. His arms don't go out, his back legs don't extend, and his back does not arch. So none of these work, but they're invoked to try to defend the idea that Oswald did it. The neuromuscular reaction is what explains him going back, compounded or in addition to the jet effect, none of which works. But it is the very thin reed that they try to stand on, Warren Commission loyalists try to stand on. And it utterly, those explications utterly fail. None of them will work. And yet they're touted by Warren Commission defenders.